Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try and do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. Tyrant. Now, this is a word that most people don't use lightly. A tyrant represents an extreme form of humanity. We usually think of them as destructive and power-hungry. Do I dare say evil? And I'm not sure, but I'm wondering whether we've heard the word more often in the last few years, often associated with certain political leaders. But who really is a tyrant? How do they operate? And who are the worst tyrants in the world? If there's anyone who knows tyrants, whether historically or present day, it's Waller Newell. Waller is a professor of political science and political philosophy at Carleton University in Ottawa. He's also the author of 7 books, including 3 on tyrants and tyranny. And he's currently a visiting faculty fellow at the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida, also a professor, and that is for civic and classical education. He joins us today. Hello, Waller.
Hello. Nice to see you.
Nice to have you here. Why are you so interested in this subject of tyrants and tyranny?
Well, there are several layers to that interest, I suppose, going back even to my childhood when all of my relatives served in World War II. And so I was aware very much of that background. And then I lived through both Cold Wars between the Soviet Union and the United States. And if you remember, Francis Fukuyama famously declared in 1989 that we had reached the end of history, by which he meant that the conflict between the two superpowers had been resolved in favor of the U.S. and the West. And he believed that because of that, democracy was now free to flourish everywhere in the world. But I would say that since 1989, conflict and strife have intensified in the world. They have not decreased. And in some ways, the dream of worldwide democracy is further away than ever.
There's a moral judgment behind the word tyranny, right? I mean, one person's tyrant could be another person's hero. So how do we decide who is a tyrant?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the category that I call reforming tyrants, such as Julius Caesar or Henry VIII or Napoleon, many people regarded them as the worst kind of tyrants, that they had a lust for power, that they ruled without law. Yet, at least as many other people profoundly admired them and looked upon them as champions of the common people and true benefactors. And the paradox about those kinds of leaders is that, yes, they do want complete power for themselves, but arguably they genuinely are motivated by a desire to do good things for their people. And that makes it easier to evaluate them than with straight out and out thugs who rule their countries like a mafia don, purely for their own self-interest.
Yeah, you have these sort of 3 large categories of tyrants, and you talk about the reformer. Can you tell us about the other 2 categories you have?
Well, the other 2, the first is what I call just garden variety kleptocrats. As I said, this is the kind of ruler who rules an entire society as if it were his own personal property to exploit as he wishes. In a way, they're like mafia dons who are called rulers. Sometimes they're called presidents, whatever. Then there's the reforming tyrant. And then there's the third kind of tyrant, which I call millenarian tyranny. And these figures are different from the other 2 categories, and I think they are peculiar to modernity. And I'm thinking about people like Robespierre, Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot. These are people who want to use absolute power not for mere reform or they would say not for their own self-interest, but they truly want to create a better world. They actually propound a utopia in which human life will be totally transformed in the future, whether you call it communism, National Socialism. And their sense of legitimacy is based on the assumption that very harsh measures will have to be taken temporarily in the present in order to create this wonderful new world for the rest of us.
Would there be something kind of Machiavellian in their approach?
I think, oddly enough, Machiavelli would criticize them for having such unrealistic expectations of what people could become. I think Machiavelli is more perfectly suited to a traditional reforming tyrant like Henry VIII. And in fact, it's often said that Henry's great minister, Cromwell, had actually read Machiavelli's The Prince when he was in Italy, and that he used it as a kind of guidebook for advising Henry on how to crush the church and protect the interests of the common people, try to promote the creation of a commercial middle class. Whereas these millenarian tyrants, as I said, they are telling us that the transformation that their revolutions will bring about are akin almost to something religious or apocalyptic, that we will literally be different people. There will be a night and day difference between the way we live now and the wonderful world that is to come. If only certain enemies of the revolution can be gotten rid of, they're the ones who stand in the way. But once that's done, we will then all live in the sunlight in a world of perfect peace and equality and community.
Mm-hmm. You know, just going back when you talked about the first category, the garden variety type of tyrant, you know, the tyrant as kleptocrat, who would be an example of that?
Well, I think examples are rife. I mean, I would think someone like the Assad family in Syria. I don't really view them as having a kind of ideological mission. They want to preserve the power and wealth that they've achieved for their own family, for their own ethnic group. And we can still find figures like that all over the world. In earlier years, you might have mentioned the Somozas. You might have mentioned Franco. I mean, that's a kind of tyranny that's both the oldest and the most widespread, even in the present, I would say.
You know, I mean, even though we see tyrants just by virtue of the definition of tyrant as something bad, something dangerous, even monsters, you mentioned Hitler, Stalin, others, yet, you know, they start off as individuals, right? They don't start off already with, you know, great power running a nation. So how is it that we allow these kinds of people to gain power until it's too late?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you look at the figures I mentioned earlier, beginning with Robespierre through Stalin, Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, what you find is that these leaders were unusually young men when they came to supreme power. Many of them were national figures or even leaders in their 30s. And in normal political life, as we know, it's very hard for a person, a man or woman, to ascend very high in political life in their 30s. So a part of what attracts people to them is that they have the charisma of being young. And young people identify with them as if they're going to rise in life along with this youthful leader. If you take the case of Nazi Germany, people frequently describe National Socialism as the Jugendbewegung, the youth movement. In other words, if somebody said, "Oh, I hear your granddaughter is in the youth movement," that would mean that she was a Nazi. She was a Nazi. So this notion of the vitality of the young somehow being embodied in the young leader, I think has a powerful command over people. Also, if you look at the backgrounds of those men, many of them, including Stalin, Hitler, Mao, believed that they had been treated in a slighting way when they were young, that they had been looked down upon, that their talents had been denied. You know, Hitler wanted to go to art school. They wouldn't let him in. Mao went to a school where he believed that people made fun of his lower class accent. Most of us get over these things in life, right? Or Lenin, for example, whose brother was executed by the Tsar as a terrorist. There's something about these type of people whereby the original hurt or injury that they feel is just so deep and burning that they can never get rid of it. And so they project that desire for revenge onto society as a whole. And they lead these revolutionary movements in part, I think, to avenge themselves for what they perceive as the unjust way they were treated in childhood. And now they, at the end of the day, can say, I'm now the ruler and master of everyone, so you should not have looked down on me.
Okay, so they're charismatic, and they seem to have a huge chip on their shoulder,
That's
which
right.
they take out as revenge. What about, are there any other common personality traits that they have?
Well, they're capable, of course, of methodical and cold-blooded violence on an absolutely massive scale. The other thing I would say, though, and not all analysts of tyranny agree with me here, but I think in some ways, people like Stalin, Hitler, and Mao were the most sincere believers in their own ideologies. I don't think they were cynics using this ideology to amass power. I think they were true believers, you know? I think Hitler really believed in the wonderful world that he was helping to build for tomorrow. And I think that's true of Stalin as well. But Stalin really believed he was Lenin's most loyal follower and that he was carrying out the building of communism in just the way that Lenin wanted.
Okay, so if that's true, and let's just say Hitler truly believed that he was building a better world, that was at the expense of certain people, meaning the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of view is that then of humanity that these tyrants have?
It's a structural similarity among all of these modern revolutionary movements going back to the French Revolution and the Jacobins, that there is always this dyadic struggle between the supporters of revolution and their enemies. So with the Jacobins, it was the bourgeoisie, the church, the aristos. They had to be wiped out. With Lenin and Stalin, you can say that, again, it was the bourgeoisie that had to be liquidated to enable socialism to flower. That was sometimes cast as the notion of the rich peasant, that this was a reactionary force that had to be gotten out of the way so that people could live selflessly without private property. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian people were identified in this ideological fantasy with the so-called rich peasant. And that's why so many of them were destroyed by Stalin in his terror famine in the Ukraine. So there's always this either-or conflict that the revolutionaries who see themselves as building the future, they have to get rid of the racial or class enemies who stand in the way of nirvana being brought about for everyone else. Mm-hmm. And the promise is always that, yes, we have to go through this terrible period now of violence, but once we've done it, then it'll never have to happen again, and there'll be nothing but peace and justice. But then the question is, well, let's say that you've gotten rid of, in the case of the French Revolution, you've gotten rid of the aristocracy, you've crushed the church, you've terrorized people. But what if what they would see as corrupt bourgeois traits or religious traits come creeping back into the people who had been left unharmed? And that's why it's sometimes said that the terror can never really end, because you're trying to transform human nature and change it. And that means that these retrograde traits, as the revolutionaries would see it, a desire for private property, a love for religion. They are always on the verge of creeping back. And that's why there has to be never-ending vigilance to make sure that the revolution goes on.
Yeah. There's a story that you relate in your book about Hitler back in 1944. You said that that after being bombed, after he was bombed, but not greatly hurt, he said, "Well, that's it. No more Mr. Nice Guy." Which seems like an incredible understatement. But when I read that, it made me think, okay, so that kind of tyrant that Hitler was, do they not see themselves as tyrants?
Of course, we can never really read anyone's inner heart and mind, but all the evidence that we have about them and how they were perceived by others suggests that, no, they were regarded as idealists, as people who wanted to build a better world. And I think, to the best of our knowledge, that really is how they saw
themselves. Yeah. And so it's interesting, too, because you talk about how they're trying to oppress these certain qualities of human nature, and they must keep doing that even after they're in power, because they're always on the verge of rising up, right? Whether it's, you said, love for religion, whether it's individual rights, perhaps. So then how effective is tyranny as a form of control over a group of people compared to democracy?
Unfortunately, it can be terribly successful, at least for a given period of time. The drive of all of these modern totalitarian, or as I call them, millenarian revolutions, is to completely submerge the individual in the collective and to eradicate any difference between self and other. And that means that individual rights that we take for granted simply have to be uprooted and gotten rid of. So I think that's the common aim. And I suppose looking on the bright side, you could say that so far, going back to, Salamis and Marathon, going up through Waterloo, so far the history of tyranny has also been the history of its eventual defeat by democracy. And that's something we can say on the positive side of the coin, that none of these tyrannies finally succeeded in the kind of global permanent dominion that they were all trying to achieve. It hasn't happened so far.
Well, you know what? So let's look at some of the world leaders today who many would say fall into the category of tyrant. Let's talk about Vladimir Putin. Is he a tyrant, and what kind of tyrant is he?
Vladimir Putin is certainly a tyrant. He is a dictator who effectively is above the law. I would say in the early part of his 20-year-odd reign, he was also a genuine reformer. He did help stabilize the Russian economy. He reinstated a lot of social welfare programs that Yeltsin had been pressured to get rid of. He stabilized the ruble, whose collapse had wiped out the savings of millions of ordinary people. And I think in that period, let's say the first 10 years or so, his popularity was genuine. I think people really looked upon him as a man who had saved the ordinary Russian from corruption and the corrupt dealings of the remainder of the party, who often simply seized what had once been property of the state and declared that it was now their property. And so he got rid of a lot of those corrupt, formerly Soviet oligarchs. Now, the problem is, of course, he replaced them with his own oligarchs. But overall, I think you could say that there was a degree of genuine support for him. Now, with the increasingly serious crisis that's unfolding in Russia because of the war in Ukraine, in other words, because the setbacks Russia has faced in Ukraine have rippled back into Russian society itself. I think there's now a degree of greater repression and monitoring of people's behavior, and a temptation by Putin to use ever more arbitrary measures. Remember, he did used to stand for election. Now, people said, well, how honest were they? And I think to a degree you can ask that question, but I also think to a degree they were relatively genuine. But now we're hearing that he's thinking of not having elections again. He's just going to remain in power without elections.
Mm-hmm. And what about, though, what do you think about his overall vision and ambition? You know, is it to reunify some form of all-powerful Russia again?
He certainly does not aim to restore the Soviet Empire. In fact, he was against the Soviet Union's ideology. He has said this many times. But I think it's fair to say that he does aim to restore a kind of greater Russia in which all of the Slavic peoples in Hungary, Poland, even arguably in the Balkans, they will be brought back into the fold of Mother Russia. So I would say that his war aims are not merely pragmatic. He isn't just a kind of 19th century militarist. I think that there is a genuine ideological and even utopian vision behind what he's doing. And his chief ideologue, Alexander Dugin, has often evoked this in terms of a new world, that Russia is waiting to be reborn in a new world in which all of the Slavic peoples are reunited.
So is he turning more millenarian in your terms?
That's an interesting question, because I remember Condoleezza Rice being asked about what he was doing in Ukraine and this vision that he has of the Slavic Empire, and she said, "Well, I met him many times, and that's not the man I met. The man I met was a very cool-headed pragmatist, someone you could talk turkey with and reach a deal with." But with all due respect to her, and she deserves a lot of respect, I suspect Putin was always that man inside. I think he always had this vision for the future, and he just bided his time, right? He did it by degrees, right? First he bit off a chunk of the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. He got away with that. Then he grabbed Crimea. He got away with that. So each time he devoured a chunk, he would wait, bide his time, rebuild his forces, and then, of course, he made the attempt to conquer all of Ukraine in a lightning blow. But I suspect he always had that vision.
Do you think that the potential to be a tyrant is always there, that you're born with it?
I think it is always there, and that you are born with it. It's a matter of education, really, and I suppose exposure to society, the norms that are instilled into us as children that make us ashamed of actually acting on those impulses. And with most people, fortunately, that works, but it doesn't work with everybody.
Let's talk about Donald Trump. Do you consider him a tyrant?
To me, and as you can imagine, I've been asked this question frequently. It's a two-part question, because on one level, you can say, is he, as a matter of empirical fact, a tyrant? And the answer is no. He couldn't have been a tyrant. Under the American system of government, with its division of powers, in some ways, the American founding was more about forestalling tyranny than anything else. And the idea was that if the three branches are contending with each other, that's going to minimize the danger either of majoritarian tyranny, minoritarian tyranny, or single-person tyranny. So the Republic did not fall. You can say, it creaked a bit. But then Trump was defeated in the election. Now, that said, the more psychological question here is, does he or did he harbor demagogic or tyrannical leanings? And there, I think we can only point to the admiration that he frequently expressed for the world's leading dictators, like Xi or like Kim. He often expressed his envy that Xi could exercise so much power so quickly to do what he thought was best. He said that he thought Kim loved the North Korean people. And when someone pointed out the absurdity of this remark and talked about the terrible labor camps and other forms of repression in North Korea, he replied, well, we've done some pretty bad things too. So I think there is a side of Trump that is attracted to these strong men. And we can't really know more than that, I think.
So you wouldn't go so far as to say he's a tyrant in the making, a potential tyrant?
He could be, sure. He could be.
And what about other current leaders? You know, who makes it to the top of your tyrant list today?
Well, it's a pretty straightforward group, I think. Certainly Xi of the PRC, certainly Putin, certainly the leaders of the Iranian Revolution. I think they would have to be at the top of the list. One thing I often try to point out is that when we talk about the People's Republic of China arguably being a despotism, we're never talking about the Chinese people. It's always wrong to say that the Chinese people support a tyrannical regime. And I think it's the same with Russia now. To cancel concerts by Russian musicians, to ban the reading of Russian classics, which has taken place in Europe because of Putin, that's a terrible mistake. That's a terribly retrogressive move. The Russian people are not guilty for Putin's activities.
And what about, you know, under your category of reformer, what about reformer tyrants? You know, who would they be in the world today?
Well, you face the same ambiguity that I mentioned earlier with people like Henry VIII or Napoleon. Let's take the leadership of President Xi in China. The Chinese regime has sunk trillions of dollars into the building of infrastructure for ordinary Chinese people, and not just in the wealthy coastal cities like Shanghai. They've done this in the interior. They have built these mammoth new housing blocks. And there's no question, I think, that on a certain level, Xi really does see himself as the benefactor of ordinary Chinese people. And he has done things that I think bear that out. But then, of course, there's the other side of the coin, which is this new system of social credit, so-called, whereby the regime monitors everything everyone does for every stage of their life. And there's a whole list of infractions which, if you commit any of them, you will be denied entrance to certain jobs. You will be denied entrance to university. And the stigma will extend to your family. So there's the side of Xi that in some ways is a real benefactor. Certainly the economic standards of the Chinese people rose under him and Deng Xiaoping. But then there's another side of him which is creating a really macabre system of social surveillance. And of course, we mustn't forget the Uyghurs and how they are being treated. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, these traits all go together sometimes in these individuals.
Oh, do you mean the millenarian kind of tyrant? They all go together?
I mean that sometimes they are both terrible despots, but on other levels do actually carry out reforms. That's what makes it so messy to evaluate. Certainly you can condemn them morally, but to sort of parse their psychology and their character traits is very complicated.
If you had to choose the worst tyrant the world has ever seen, who would that be?
to me, it would come down to a toss-up between Hitler and Stalin. I think both of them were responsible for the deaths of tens of millions. I think Hitler could never have begun World War II and thereby the Holocaust without his pact with Stalin. So in a way, aside from Hitler himself, Stalin was the man who was most singly responsible for the catastrophe of World War II ever happening. And I suppose some would add Mao Zedong to that list as well, simply because of the catastrophic loss of life in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. If the numbers, if they are to believe, are absolutely staggering. Again, they're in the tens of millions.
And do we even really know the complete story with Mao Zedong?
No, I don't think so.
No. You know, it's interesting because I did a panel once on the world's most evil dictators.
Oh, yeah.
And yes, and those three names came up, but we had to decide on a, so-called winner. Who do you think it was of those three?
It's very hard. I can't get further than reducing it to that trio, but I just can't nominate one of them for top of the list.
Yeah. Well, on that panel, the award went to Stalin on that panel.
I can see reasons for that.
Yeah, but as you say, there are arguments to be had for all of them.
Yeah.
Do you think the world today has become more divisive, more violent, less democratic?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And I was mentioning earlier that there's always this dyad of revolutionaries versus their enemies, going all the way back to the French Revolution. Well, today we might say that our world is beginning to express another of these dichotomies, and we don't really know what shape it's taking yet. But you can sum it up roughly by posing the contrast between globalism and populism. There's a new kind of hostile energy building up, I think, between these two views of life. So you have
I want you to explain that a little more. What do you mean?
So you have people who are nothing but in favor of further economic globalization. And this can often involve certain kinds of social policies like fighting climate change, limiting the use of carbon-based fuel, and perhaps something akin to the beginning of a world government. I think that's one extreme. On the other side of the coin, you have leaders like Putin, but also Viktor Orban in Hungary, who are saying, no, we're drawing a line in the sand. This is not what we want for our peoples. We're not going to be homogenized and turned into part of a world state. Orban says Hungary is a Christian country, and we have every right to call ourselves that, and we're not going to give up that designation. We're not going to become an entirely secular society.
So do you feel, what is your biggest concern then with the state of tyranny today?
Well, I am a very strong supporter of the NATO democracies' help to Ukraine. Short of an actual involvement on the ground by NATO forces in Ukraine against Russia, which I would not want to see. But short of that, I'm 100% in favor of giving them everything that they need and everything that the West can possibly manage. But there is a growing movement in the American Republican Party here that is increasingly isolationist and increasingly open in its opposition to the NATO democracies, including the US, helping Ukraine. And I worry about that because, especially in the younger generation of the Republican Party today, this wish to withdraw from the world, this return to the isolationism of the 1930s is becoming more and more widespread. And the younger the Republicans in Congress are, the likelier they are to side with that isolationist view. You have the older hands like Lindsey Graham. He remains a committed interventionist, neoconservative. But among the younger people like J.D. Vance, it's more and more clear that they simply do not believe that the U.S. should be involved in any kind of foreign conflicts. So that bothers me. It gives me concern.
Mm-hmm. Well, it makes me wonder, too. I mean, I go back to what we talked about earlier, that tyrants are one individual, and it takes many people to give them power in the first place, doesn't it? So, is the story of tyrants as much about these exceptional individuals as it is about us, just regular folks?
I would say so, certainly. I mean, the reason that Hitler eventually became the ultimate dictator of Germany was that he won a plurality of German votes in a free and open election. It wasn't a majority, but overnight, the Nazi Party went from being a tiny party into being the single largest delegation in the Reichstag. And when President von Hindenburg passed away, and you had the Reichstag fire, which some say the Nazis staged, Hitler was the logical choice because no one else in the cabinet had the degree of popular legitimacy that he did.
Mm-hmm. So if that's true, and we think about that and apply it to what's happening in the world today, what does that mean then about all of us? And how do we take responsibility then for what's happening?
Well, we have to be vigilant. We have to know something about the history of tyranny. This is a point that I've made throughout all three of my books, that we have to remember that these people and their forces do exist. And I think sometimes it's the very comparative success of liberal democracy. I don't say it's perfect, but comparatively speaking, it has an impressive record of generating prosperity, being largely peaceable, at least internally. This, I think, can sometimes lull us into thinking that tyranny is just a thing of the past, that it's something old-fashioned and retrograde. But then we learn to our disappointment every so often that that's not the case, that not all regimes are living in the same historical space that we are. They see the world differently. They think that certain great things can be achieved through dictatorship and through despotism. Democratic electorates just have to remind themselves that history has not come to an end, and that the danger of despotic rule is always just beneath the surface, not only in non-Western countries, but in our own Western countries as well.
What does that make you think then about the lessons of history? Do we not learn from them?
I think we do learn, but we also develop a kind of sleeping sickness whereby we have to be, unfortunately, jolted every so often into remembering that as long as there's been human history, there have been attempts at tyranny. Even though, as I said earlier, so far none of them has gotten the kind of world dominion that it started out aiming for. In other words, unfortunate as it may be, something like Putin's invasion of Ukraine may be a necessary wake-up call to remind us that these figures are still around. I mean, I remember John Kerry saying how astonished he was when Putin did one of his earlier invasions. He said he seemed like a man out of the 19th century, as if we'd just left that behind. And how on earth could he still be like that now, such a retrograde figure. But the point is that we've never left it entirely behind. And I think that the tyrannical temptation is a built-in and recurrent element of human psychology. Not in all people, not even in most people, but there's always a certain group of people who are contemplating this, at least in their own minds.
So we need to be on guard, basically,
Yes.
is what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think the study of history is a good place to begin, especially young people today.
This was a fascinating discussion, Waller. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
It was my very great pleasure, Mary. Thank you so much.
That is Waller Newell. He is a professor of political science and political philosophy at Carleton University. He is also the author of 7 books, including Tyranny, A New Interpretation, Tyrants and Tyranny, and Revolution. Waller is currently a visiting faculty fellow and professor at the Hamilton Center for Civic and Classical Education at the University of Florida. Now, for more information on his work, his books, and articles, please visit our show notes. That's it for today's podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. And please follow us on social. Our handle is @CramIdeas, and we'd love your feedback. Thanks for listening, and see you back here again.